Genesis 47, an exegetical and biblical theological commentary. Genesis chapter 47 functions as the critical narrative hinge connecting the patriarchal sojourn in Canaan to the corporate formation of Israel within Egypt. It serves as a structural bridge between the Genesis narratives and the Exodus deliverance. Situated within Walter Kaiser Jr.'s Promise Plan framework, this chapter demonstrates the unwavering continuity of the divine commitment made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In Genesis 46, verses 3 and 4, Yahweh reassured Jacob at Beersheba not to fear the descent into Egypt, promising to make him a great nation there and to bring him up again. Genesis 47 records the initial phase of that promise's physical fulfillment amidst a global agricultural catastrophe. Within the Hebraic worldview, Egypt represents both a place of temporary shelter and a domain of latent spiritual exile. The narrative unfolds against the backdrop of divine providence over earthly kingdoms. While the surrounding ancient Near Eastern world experiences economic and demographic collapse due to severe famine, Yahweh sovereignly preserves the covenant seed. Through Joseph's administrative wisdom, God isolates and multiplies his chosen people in the eastern Nile Delta, preserving their sacred identity and advancing his singular redemptive trajectory toward national redemption and possession of the land. The narrative opens with Joseph acting as the covenantal mediator, presenting 5 of his brothers and his father Jacob before Pharaoh. This strategic encounter highlights the tension between imperial Egyptian culture and the distinct identity of Yahweh's covenant line. Joseph instructs his brothers to declare explicitly their trade as shepherds, an occupation designated as an abomination to the Egyptians. Far from being a social disadvantage, this occupational taboo is providentially utilized by God to secure geographical isolation in the fertile region of Goshen. By establishing a distinct territorial enclave, the seed of Abraham is structurally shielded from Egyptian cultural assimilation, intermarriage, and pagan syncretism, thereby safeguarding the holy seed during its developmental stage into a nation. The climax of the audience occurs when Jacob is brought before Pharaoh and pronounces a blessing upon the imperial monarch. In the cognitive environment of the ancient Near East, Pharaoh was viewed as a divine king, the earthly incarnation of Ra or Horus. Yet in this encounter, the literary structure presents a striking irony. The frail, landless patriarch acts as the superior spiritual authority, dispensing divine favor upon the ruler of the world's greatest empire. This act directly manifests the Abrahamic promise that through the patriarch's line the families of the earth would be blessed, as stated in Genesis 12, verse 3. In response to Pharaoh's inquiry regarding his age, Jacob describes his 130 years as few and evil, acknowledging that his lifespan has not attained to the longevity of his father's. The Hebrew term for sojourning highlights Jacob's self-awareness as a pilgrim who does not view his present earthly conditions as his final inheritance. His characterization of his days as evil reflects the severe afflictions, betrayals, and bereavements that marked his life, yet his posture remains anchored in God's transcendent promise plan. This section of the chapter contrasts the escalating impoverishment of the Egyptian populace with the quiet preservation and provision granted to the house of Israel. As the famine intensifies, Joseph executes a comprehensive administrative restructuring of the Egyptian state. Joseph systematically collects all the currency, livestock, and personal land of the Egyptians in exchange for grain, ultimately reducing the Egyptian population to state-dependent tenant farmers under a permanent 20% tax burden. Land ownership shifts entirely to the crown, with the exception of the priestly allotments. While the indigenous population surrenders its private property and autonomy to Pharaoh, Israel receives a designated possession within Goshen by royal decree and divine oversight. This juxtaposition underscores a major biblical motif. Under human imperial rule, human autonomy and property become centralizing mechanisms of state servitude, whereas under Yahweh's covenantal care, his people are sustained and granted property amidst judgment. Joseph's management demonstrates how God uses human administrative structures to preserve human life globally, while uniquely shielding the line through which the promised seed will come. The final section of the chapter shifts focus from the political economy of Egypt back to the spiritual destiny of the patriarch Jacob and his burgeoning family. Verse 27 serves as the structural and theological climax of the chapter. Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it, and were fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. The specific terminology, fruitful and multiplied, deliberately echoes the creation mandate in Genesis 1, verse 28, and the explicit covenantal promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Israel's demographic expansion in Goshen marks the transition from a single family to a nation in formation. Sensing his impending death after 17 years in Egypt, Jacob summons Joseph and demands a solemn oath, placing Joseph's hand under his thigh, a traditional gesture sealing a binding covenantal obligation. Jacob commands that he must not be buried in Egypt, but carried out to be laid in the cave of Machpelah alongside his fathers. This insistence is not mere nostalgic sentimentality, it is a profound declaration of faith. Jacob refuses permanent naturalization in Egypt, affirming that Israel's ultimate destiny and true inheritance remain tied to the promised land of Canaan. Upon receiving Joseph's sworn oath, Israel bows in worship at the head of his bed. This final physical act signifies Jacob's complete reliance on Yahweh's promise plan, acknowledging that death itself cannot sever his connection to the inheritance guaranteed by divine oath. The New Testament authors organically connect the historical realities of Genesis 47 to the ultimate fulfillment of God's redemptive purposes in Jesus Christ, recognizing that the patriarchal sojourn prefigured the spiritual pilgrimage and future hope of the whole people of God. The author of Hebrews selects Jacob's deathbed actions as a supreme demonstration of faith. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. Citing the Septuagint translation of Genesis 47 verse 31, Hebrews frames Jacob's blessing and posture of worship as an eschatological act. Jacob looked beyond Egypt's temporal prosperity to the unseen, future realization of God's covenant promises. In his speech before the Sanhedrin, Stephen highlights Jacob's descent into Egypt with 75 souls, thereby placing Genesis 47 within the grand sweep of salvation history. Stephen underscores that God's presence and redemptive activity were never confined to a specific temple or geographic location, but accompanied the patriarchs in foreign lands as they awaited the ultimate deliverer. Paul expands the Abrahamic land promise, demonstrating that the original concrete promise of Canaan given to Jacob was the foundational archetype for a universal cosmic inheritance. Jacob's refusal to be buried in Egypt mirrors the believer's refusal to find ultimate citizenship in the present worldly order. Read through the lens of Walter Kaiser Jr.'s Promise Plan theology, Genesis 47 reveals the organic unity and progressive development of canonical revelation. The chapter demonstrates that God's promises are neither suspended by crisis nor spiritualized into abstraction. Yahweh's covenant loyalty guarantees both the physical preservation and spiritual distinctiveness of ethnic Israel within the broader framework of his redemptive design. The narrative establishes a structural irony that reverberates across redemptive history. World empires appear sovereign, controlling land, wealth, and populations, yet they are structurally dependent upon the blessing mediated through Yahweh's chosen servants. Jacob's encounter with Pharaoh establishes the eternal principle that the bearer of divine promise, regardless of outward vulnerability, holds true spiritual preeminence over worldly power. Furthermore, the physical realities of Genesis 47, the settlement in Goshen, the exemption from Egyptian serfdom, the extraordinary multiplication, and the sacred obligation to bury in Machpelah, maintain their concrete historical validity while simultaneously pointing toward ultimate redemptive fulfillments. The physical land of Canaan promised to Jacob's physical descendants remains an irrevocable covenantal pledge, preserving the non-supersessionist distinction of ethnic Israel within the unified people of God. Concurrently, Jacob's deathbed oath testifies that temporal abundance in a foreign land can never substitute for the promised rest of Yahweh's kingdom. The patriarch's refusal to remain in Egypt prefigures the ultimate hope of resurrection. in which the physical, concrete earth is fully redeemed and filled with the glory of God through the Messiah, the ultimate seed of Abraham.